Greetings all, and welcome to another edition of Interregnum, the official podcast of Arktos Media Limited. I'm your host, John Bruce Leonard, Editor-in-Chief of Arktos. Today, I'm afraid I'm alone since our Assistant Editor-in-Chief, Martin Locker, is out of town, and so it's just me and our guest. Please welcome Richard Story. Richard Story is an Arktos author and the author of a fairly recent publication, The Uniqueness of Western Law. So please, Richard, welcome.
Thanks very much, John. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. You're always immaculately dressed and spoken as well. I'm feeling a bit like a pleb here in my polo top. But,
not at all. Great. So our last conversation with Richard was actually about his book, and you can find that on our website, as well as the book itself. And I strongly recommend that all of our listeners go at once to that webpage and look into it. It's an excellent book and a very interesting book, which treats of libertarianism from an unusual angle, basing it on the history of Western civilization, essentially from the European past, particularly in what one might call the High Middle Ages or Christendom, and founding it as well on the basis of religion. Richard, we're going to be talking today as well about the Catholic Church and about Catholicism more broadly. So this will also give us a chance to go into some of the material which is included in your book. You've recently published a number of articles for Crisis magazine, and we're going to be using those as the basis for our conversation. So perhaps you could choose one of your latest articles and tell us a little bit about it.
Well, the two articles I'd written were to challenge, I suppose I could say, mainstream Catholicism, or perhaps modernist Catholicism, you could say, even though modernism is a heresy in the Catholic Church, technically. I wanted to challenge Catholics who would describe themselves as Catholic socialists, or left-wing Catholics, they also might describe themselves as. And also, I wanted to address the fact that there is a lot of talk of white guilt, white privilege, all of this propagandist talk, really, against ethnic Europeans in the church, simply because socialism and this very, very negative idea towards ethnicity or having some sort of ethnic pride is just totally un-Catholic. I should say it's not the tradition of Christianity, and not being traditional, not having any voice at all for most of the past 2,000 years in the church. That means that it is, by definition, not acceptable. It's not part of the ordinary teaching of the church. It's totally contrary to the ordinary teaching, and so it can never be acceptable. It is heresy, really. So I wanted to address that. The reason personally I wanted to do that is because since writing my book, and in my book I do try to base libertarian principles that we have in the West, not just in Christianity, but in the European tradition pre-Christianity. But I also want to say that Christianity very much picks up the torch of the ancient world in preserving our very unique understanding of law. And the way,
and if I may, Richard, if
sure.
I understand your argument, it's not only preserving it, but in a way you view it also as perfecting that same tradition. Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Yeah, that is basically my position. That's what I see from the historical data. And so when I finished writing my book, and I've tried to publicize it myself as well, obviously you get feedback from people. Interestingly enough, although I'm most often described as being a medieval libertarian, it was from libertarians, modernist libertarians. It was from them that I received most flack for the book. I actually received a lot of acceptance from people who might describe themselves as alt-righters or classical conservatives, distributists, those kinds of people, traditionalists, that sort of area of what we call the right wing. And so, basing all of these principles in the church, I've got this broad interest in the medieval period and the church and the way European ideas and philosophy has been, taking the words out of my mouth, perfected by the church. And I see the church as being very much a part of European history, its culmination, in fact. And so, coming to my point about white privilege and white guilt and these ideas coming into the church, finding myself having so much in common with those on the right who would have a more identitarian outlook, politically, socially, what have you, I could see very clearly from my knowledge that this just has no place in the church at all. In fact, the Catholic position is that your ethnicity and your realm, your country, your nation, in the old sense of the word, this is something sacred. It should be something sacred for you. Part of the definition of piety, what it means to be pious, is to have respect for one's family and those intermediary institutions, but also familial groups which work their way outwards up towards, let's say, the king at the top, for instance. And a part of that, of course, is kinship. It's your tribe, if you want, and then working outwards from that. And of course, Europeans have a beautiful multiplicity of ethnicities, and we're all very closely related. We're still, as different as they might look. A Swede, for instance, an ethnic Swede, is actually a cousin, really, of an Italian person. I don't look the least bit Swedish, but I mean that's the genetic data, or they are the genetic data, I should say. And so I was baffled on the one hand by this position by so many within the Catholic Church. And also I felt it was my duty to try and defend what is the traditional position, because so many of my readers and friends and other people might be totally confused as to what the traditional Christian position actually is on ethnicity.
I think there's a lot of confusion circling around this today, and in a way it's somewhat understandable insofar as there's just a generalized confusion about the topic itself, not to speak of the topic vis-a-vis the Catholic Church. But there are also some complications, I think, when approaching Christianity itself. One of the most evident of these complications is the fact that Christianity in our day is not unitary as it once was, insofar as there are many different churches involved. You're coming at this from the Catholic perspective, but I think for many people, particularly who were not raised within the Catholic perspective or who stand outside of the Christian perspective as such, there might be a tendency to confuse Protestantism with Catholicism, to not understand the distinction between these things, and also to take for granted some of the accusations which have been leveled against Christianity in general, particularly by, say, the French New Right, but also by a great many other individuals, to the effect that, on the one hand, Christianity is an enormous leveling agent in our days. And this, I think, actually speaks to both of the articles that you've written, Richard. In the first place, Christianity is considered the root of egalitarianism by many of these thinkers. Egalitarianism is considered to be a product of Christianity, in fact, a direct descendant of Christianity, its natural logical outcome, particularly if you subtract God from the equation, but even just generally. And on the other hand, following in the same egalitarian strain, Christianity is considered to be a universalizing agent. It is considered to be an agent which takes the human being and places this abstract human being over and above all ethnic contexts, all specific religious, not religious, but all specific national or customary heritages, and in a way favors this human being over those to the extent that it's even willing to eradicate those completely. This is how the argument runs, at least. So this response that you make is very interesting, because you're giving a Catholic grounding for a legitimate response to both of these specific critiques against Christianity. Perhaps we could begin with the economic side of things. So your article addresses in particular socialism, which has been argued is an element of the Christian heritage. There are, of course, statements in the books of the New Testament which could be used to favor socialism, particularly if they're drawn completely out of context. But and some people have even claimed that Christianity was the earliest form of communism, etc., etc. So what would your response be to this kind of critique of Christianity, Richard?
Okay, lots of things I want to answer there. As usual, John, you've got an amazing mind and you can think of several different things at once. It's great for me because now I've got a list of things I can talk about. So firstly, you said there's a lot of confusion, many folks, and I mean, you know more about this than I would, you'd have more to say, but I think especially with Americans, because the founding of the American nation was built very much on Protestant grounds, and there's a lot of Puritan influence and Quaker influence, and there's a lot of sects, I'll say, influencing the Constitution and the general political milieu of the country. I think that there's a big disconnect with the American mind, especially American ideas about conservatism, and the European mind in this respect, because the European mind is very much more built on Catholicism, and where it isn't, it's kind of reactionary towards Catholicism. And in America, it's just a totally different situation. I mean, there's still, of course, a lot of common ground, but we just got to be very careful not to talk past each other as well. So I think, yes, okay, for Americans, seeing Protestantism, it's very divided, and there's all sorts of different ideas. It can give one the idea that, well, who really knows,
right?
You know, just to put it, you know, in lay terms, and that's what people think, right? And when they see Catholicism, it's just kind of weird, you know, guys with all sorts of bizarre hats, and they're going around, and there's Italian guys wearing lace, and lace, you know, it's just a bit off-putting. I mean, you look, and there's 2,000 years of history. There's all sorts of bad things that have happened. There's a lot of bad guys. I mean, there's great stuff as well, but you know, you never really remember the good stuff, do you, John?
No.
You know, it's not so interesting either. You know, reading
and
about,
not so many books are written about it either.
Not so many books. No, I mean, who wants to read about monks draining swamps? It's not a page turner.
Exactly.
Naughty boys working their way up to becoming the Pope. Now that's exciting. That's titillating, you know. In any Christian group, you're eventually going to get some imperfect people, because we're all imperfect. I know that's, by saying people are imperfect, I'm implying a lot of idealism there, but I think we've all got that, and that's how we all fundamentally think, so I'm totally comfortable with it. We're all imperfect, even if you were to go to a church which has been set up by some guy who's somehow been ordained a pastor. He's made up his own ideas and his own church just around the corner from you in some idyllic place in the south of the US. Eventually, you're going to end up with problems, and you might end up with a bad pastor, for instance, that kind of thing. So I think American Protestants, particularly when they're on the right, I would say, don't simply dismiss Catholicism out of hand because there are bad things that have happened in its history. There are probably bad things that have happened in your own individual history, if I can address the audience that way. And nobody is perfect. In fact, because of there are so many bad things that have occurred and so many problems that have had to be overcome, I do think that it is, literally speaking, miraculous that the Catholic Church has survived, and in as good a condition as it is today. And yes, I would say in as good a condition as it is today, despite people still having many complaints about it. If you look at history, we're doing quite well at the moment. Things are not too bad, you know. So that's what I'd say about that. Well, and the economics, you address the economics. People think, well, was Jesus a socialist? Again, who knows, you know? Maybe it depends what church you go to. Well, no, he wasn't a socialist. The very idea of something like socialism, capitalism, I mean, these ideas didn't exist.
Exactly.
The practices didn't exist. There was just no such thing. You had the classical Greco-Roman concept of property, which is far away from the kind of discussion you might have with a libertarian, say, on property rights. The old idea of property, Cicero gives a brilliant example. It's just the perfect example of a theatre. And let's say that the theatre is commonly owned. It's a public thing. And out of that, I can acquire a seat there in order for some public purpose. It's to enjoy the show. It's a cooperative thing. This is how the ancient mind thought about property in terms of me. This is mine, like a child might say, or one of your dogs even, John. You might say, "This is mine, get away," and the others have to scatter. I mean, that would have been, in terms of law, that would have been separated for something like someone discovers a treasure trove, or they go out hunting and they've made a kill, and then they can acquire that. But the ancient European understanding of property, it was very much more geared towards what is the common good. What's the summum bonum? Excuse me. Because we are the social animals. We're born into families. This is how we flourish. This is our highest good, again, to use idealistic language, because that's what very much informed ancient European thought, and certainly traditional Christian thought. So I just find the idea that Jesus is a socialist to be utter nonsense. The idea even that Jesus looked upon the state favorably is highly questionable. Highly questionable. When asked to pay a tax, and this is to the Romans' mind. This isn't things that are going on in the temple and usury, of course, which Christ was violently against. Their attitude towards the Romans, when asked to pay a small tax, there's the story of the miracle of the coin found in the fish. Jesus sort of wanted to make a joke about this, to say that well, sons aren't really expected to pay taxes now, are they? And of course, he was the Son of God. And of course, the idea of rendering what belongs to Caesar, because it has Caesar's face on it, was a bit of a joke. Because as Christ said, well, we have the face of God. So ultimately, we're supposed to be focusing on what is the ideal? What is the ideal that we're working towards? And the state wasn't really. There's no indication that the state was what Christ had in mind as being the ideal. And so, Peter goes and catches this fish and gets a coin out, and it's a bit of a joke, really, and gives that to the Romans. But I just find it absurd that Christians would think that there's somehow a more benevolent answer to be found in the state forcing someone to pay up some money and for it to be distributed that way, rather than through charitable means, rather than me sincerely wanting to help my neighbor. It's just absurd. Of course, they point to the Book of Acts and they say, well, in the Book of Acts, they're supposed to have shared lots of things. They had everything in common. And I'd say, okay, well, yeah, that is absolutely fine, but you do still see in that very chapter and throughout, that people still owned their houses, and they still had private property, but they were just looking after each other.
Right.
And of course,
there's an element of voluntarism, isn't there? I mean, they're voluntarily agreeing to be part of this community, rather than it being some kind of overarching statal apparatus which is forcing them into a certain relation with one another.
For sure. For sure, and it's not totally individualistic. It's not very individualistic at all, because of course the focus, you've got to bear this in mind all the time. Whenever this comes up as a topic, the focus is on what is the common good.
Right. What
is the common good? They have God in mind over all of us, and we're supposed to be working together as a body. There's the strongest form of corporatism you could imagine in the idea of Christianity and what Christ was trying to establish as his community. But this in no way means that the individual is no longer an individual any more than the hand is no longer a hand. And the socialist idea of distributing to anyone who has any kind of need is just totally dismissed by St. Paul in, you have to excuse me, I think it's 1 Corinthians. He says, whoever doesn't work, let him not eat. Because there were many trying to take advantage of the charity within the church and simply joining so that they could basically drink their money away and have their spouses or children looked after by the church, as was totally dismissed. Now, how often do you have all of this talked about? It's not really talked about. It's just fashionable to think of Jesus as being some anarchist, sort of proto-communist in the past. And, well, who knows really what he was teaching? And, you can kind of see the flowerings of communism in his writings. But it's a total nonsense. And the tradition from the first century, from the people who walked with Christ and their writings and things they had to say, this is absolutely nowhere to be seen. It's the idea of the common good. Elements of common property, of course, come into that. Naturally, they will. It's not just about negative individualistic law. Leave me alone and my stuff. I'm Google. I'm a private company. Everything I do is voluntary. Leave me alone. That child I sold heroin to. I didn't coerce him. He wanted to buy it. I didn't do anything wrong. Neither the communist aspect nor the hyper-individualist aspect are to be found anywhere in Christian history at all. I suppose that would bring us onto the topic of egalitarianism and universalism, these labels put upon the church.
And I might just note that it's interesting that many of these accusations which are brought against the church tend to be mirrored by precisely the polar opposite accusations which are brought against the same church. And I think this goes to your point that it's fashionable nowadays to criticize the church. And indeed, in a certain sense, has been fashionable for some time now. This is almost the entire bent of the Enlightenment with this anti-theological ire. But one can claim of the church at the same time that it's a leveling, egalitarianizing force, that it's bringing people down to a single level. And yet at the same time, one of the classic critiques of the Catholic Church is that it was the great supporter of the aristocracy and the defender of vested rights, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's also important to recognize that these charges which are brought against the church very often are brought by individuals who simply have this kind of opposition to the church, this hostility to the church, and they want to find some kind of a pretext for airing it. And this pretext can take a very wide range of different forms.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you on everything that you just said, from the point you made about individuals having some personal, like you say, ire against the church. They've got a particular bone to pick. And you may not ever actually arrive on what that problem is they have, what that deep-seated issue is. And so they'll accuse Christianity historically of one thing and then the exact opposite thing, and they flip-flop. A classic example, which I am actually quite saddened about, really, is folks on the right who are atheistic, or they're quite fond of older pagan religions, European pagan religions. And they'll say things, on the one hand, they'll say, oh, Christianity is really pacifistic and it totally weakened men. It has this really feminizing effect, or emasculating effect, or had this effect on European man. And on the other hand, oh, those nasty Christians and their crusades, or their stopping the pagans from invading another place because they not aborted. What's the word they would use? They basically left their female infants to the elements.
They exposed
to die.
Infants. Exactly.
That's the word. Thank you, John. Exposed, so obvious. And then they would raid a neighbouring town to steal their women. And after a long time, the church had to say, okay, well, what is the just war theory? Okay, enough is enough. We're going to have to do something. And you see this flip-flopping quite a lot. In terms of egalitarianism, I don't see how it's fair to level that against the church at all. Like you've just said, look at the structure of the church. Look at the hierarchy within the church. I don't even know what the argument is, John. I don't even know what it is. Maybe the best sort of argument along these lines was put forward by Alain de Benoit. You mentioned the French Nouveau Droit before, and he's brilliant. I don't want to say anything bad against him. I do think probably his deep-seated issue, and I think a lot of Frenchmen have this, is that, well, they started the French Revolution and helped along what is kind of jokingly called the Second French Revolution, the American Revolution as well. And I don't think it's in the French psyche to want to say, oops, sorry, everyone.
That was probably an error.
It's just not there. So better to say, forget this bit of history. Let's talk about the bit before. That bit's fine. Just ignore the rest. Ignore that 1,500 years. Ignore it. And of course, when you have mainstream academia on your side in this respect, who will only talk about the Middle Ages in very, very negative terms, if it's mentioned at all.
Exactly. And very dismissively as well, exactly, if it's mentioned.
Very dismissively.
Exactly.
They'll dismiss the entire Middle Ages as being the Dark Ages.
Right.
Academics do that very frequently.
Look at the names themselves, the Dark Ages, even the Middle Ages, right? That time that is inconveniently set between classical antiquity and then modernity, right? With the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, right? It's that inconvenient Middle Age.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Don't worry about this bit. Yeah, so there was a darkening, and then we had the enlightening, and now everything's okay. Now we've got perspective, so don't worry about it. We can just go back to the Romans, and we'll do that. And don't worry about the Eastern Roman Empire. It's boring, Yeah. So this is the general attitude, and so it seems that many on the right are perfectly comfortable. They feel totally comfortable and accepted to just go along with this, and of course it's difficult. It takes a lot of work to read, but I mean, come on, this is our heritage.
Right.
This is very much our heritage. But let me get to the point about egalitarianism. I'm just, beating around the bush here, aren't I? I don't think there's any egalitarianism, even from the very start, even from the words of Christ, because I mean, just within the very strong corporatist language with which Christianity was birthed, you have the idea that there's the mind of the group, and there are fathers within the group, and there are those who could be more burdensome within the group. There are those who are more needy. There are those who are perhaps better at working with their hands, let's say. Now, the point is that we're not supposed to shame any of these people. We're not supposed to indulge in any misery or hopelessness that might come with having those within our family unit, or those within our tribe, or those within larger contexts, who might make life a bit difficult. If we want to make the world ideal, if we want to make the world as perfect as we can, we have to undertake stewardship, which we have whether we like it or not, by our very nature, by our faculties. Whether we like it or not, John, we are stewards of this planet. We are the ones who, yes, okay, we might be very small in comparison to the size of the planet, and nature might be a terrible thing at times, but we are really quite remarkable. Man, at his best, and of course you can talk about that in terms of genetics, you can talk about that whatever way you want. Man at his best, the ideal man, is a remarkable thing. His mind and his hands give him a tremendous amount of control over the elements themselves, over weather. We've been able to control weather in remarkable ways. Hardly anyone dies as a result of the elements. That was a very common thing before. Animals themselves, and of course each other, and those who are weaker than us. Now, what are we to do? Are we to simply just destroy those who are weaker than ourselves? That causes all kinds of different problems, as does slavery, in fact. Even slavery. I mean, slavery is arguably one of the biggest causes of the downfall of the Roman Empire, because of the damage that it does economically. Now, I mean, it's not my position to say that it is just ipso facto wrong, because of course the Christian tradition says that slavery is something that just happens. It's something that just happens. So what I'm saying is that we are very dangerous. Our minds and our bodies and what we're capable of, even in our small little lives, can have a tremendous effect on the whole world, on our culture, everything. Everything we do has an effect outwards. Just like when we get into a car, we're getting into a very dangerous weapon. And it's very easy to go on autopilot and to just drive around, and then you come to and you can't remember the last 5 minutes of driving that you've been doing. And we can be like that ourselves. And the way that Christianity continued the ancient tradition was to say that we can't afford to do that. We can't afford to do that. Not with each other, not with the world around us, not with whatever faculties we've been given. And this is where the idea of the common good comes from. And this isn't specifically Christianity. This comes from the idea of the polis. This was a Greek thing that was going on. What is the best life that can be that can be lived? Sorry, you can tell how much.
Nice touch. It was rather old English.
Did it sound nice?
It did. It sounded very poetic, Richard.
Ye oldie.
Yeah.
With this beard, I can get away with that.
Exactly right. That beard and that accent, you're fine.
Yeah. But coming back to good pronunciation, and good theology, I hope. This continued into the Roman world, but the Stoics had their own idea of egalitarianism too. And so I think all of those on the right who are going to say, oh, paganism wonderful, oh, Christianity bad, probably because Jesus was Jewish, and Jews, so Christianity bad. It's a Jewish prick, or something like that. No, the Stoics, the beloved Roman Empire, and the top philosophy of the Roman elites, Stoicism, had its own idea of egalitarianism too.
This is present in the ancient philosophers as well. One can find it in Plato, even in Aristotle. So there it is.
Yeah. I'm pretty much going to say exactly the same thing when I get onto universalism as well, by the way.
Yeah, very good.
But there we have it. The Stoics had their own idea of egalitarianism. If you're going to call Christianity egalitarian, because it continued the idea that, rationally speaking, for law to be what law is supposed to be, which is rational and geared towards the common good, and sort of divine as well. It's something we're receiving. It's something we're perceiving. It's coming from. It's transcendent. If it is to be that, then it must be a ruling law. We must have the rule of law. This is the unique Western tradition, legal tradition, or jurisprudence, I should say. And so the Stoics, they were trying this. The Roman Empire were trying this. The Roman Empire wanted to have a rule of law over the various tribes that they were attempting to govern, and were doing a good job of. There was, of course, the Pax Romana, and that lasted for at least 200 years. That's really remarkable. And how did they do it? How did they do it? Okay, well, they had from the individual man and his family, he had his hearth, and the law started as much from that point as it did from the top of the gods. It started as much from that point, because the man and his hearth, the fire must be continued, the family name must be continued. The fire is symbolic of this. The fire was, because it was maintained by the oldest son from generation to generation, it was a place of connecting with one's ancestors. Oh, and we still do this. This is still in our psychology. We have, I'm looking at my fireplace now, and I have pictures of my family over the fireplace. We still very much do that. And I should say also, Catholicism continues that too. And so Rome said, okay, from that point, and the sort of tribal religions that form, and they form with their totems, if you like, where gods of different tribes come together, and we're trying to create some kind of unifying liturgy, some kind of unifying way that we are receiving what is going to be for our good, what's going to be for the common good. And this is basically the Roman project. Look at any historian of Rome worth their weight, and you'll see that the Roman project was very much about the summum bonum. It was about the common good, trying to facilitate trade between tribes.
Right, the republic, the res publica, the public thing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And did they do it perfectly? No. They had a lot of problems. You read it, it's a great big mess. But then you come out and you look at the whole picture, and especially on the right, we think, oh, how wonderful.
Yeah, right.
Oh, this is very exciting. And you teach your children about it. You take them to the museum and dress up as Romans, and it's all very exciting and fun. Because and I really believe this, because there is something divine about this quest. There is something there that the ancient European man was reaching out towards. And Christianity was just a continuation of that. Now, could you call the Roman Empire egalitarian in any way? I think.
Don't think so. I think not.
I think traditionalists
you'd be hard pressed to do so, I think.
Absolutely, no one would say that. It would be absurd. It would be absurd. Whether you're a traditionalist like Evola, or if you're more of a modernist like Nietzsche, you can't say that. It's nonsense. And so Christianity was a continuation of this. Isn't it some Jewish trick, though? Jesus was a Jew, and I don't like Jews, or something like that. That's the whole point. The whole point in the context of Christianity, when you're reading the early church writers, the whole point was that Jesus was Jewish, and that the Roman Empire were perceived as the big baddies by the Jews. Because Jesus said to the Jews, God had to bear with you all this time. You're so stiff-necked against him. He sends the prophets. What happens? You kill them. And he says, you're going to kill me as well. You're going to kill me as well. And this is Christ in Matthew chapter 21. He said, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to another people. And that word people is actually ethnoi, I think it is in the grammatical context. But it's our word ethnicity.
Yeah.
It's
right.
ethnicity,
Ethnoi, right,
nation. Yes. Yeah. And so he literally meant a people. So he's saying it's going to be taken away from this tribe of people, and it's going to be given to another people. Who was it given to? The big baddies. It was given to the Romans. It was given to the Greco-Roman world. It was given to the European man, who all this time had been reaching out to find God, to search for the Logos, to philosophically try to understand what's there beyond the material, and why we can perceive these things, why Plato can talk about these ideals, real ideals that we can perceive. They're just as real as the table my laptop's on right now. Before a tree had ever been cut down and a table made out of it, the idea of a tree was there. And that idealism, that as the Europeans, the Romans, the Roman mind accepted this Messiah, as St. Paul said, to make the Jews jealous and to help them realize that all this time they rejected and rejected and rejected, and these people over there who didn't know God, who were searching, it was given over to them. So these people, they accepted the Messiah, and they said, this man who came and said that he is the truth, this bridge of the divine to man, at this particular time in history, at this particularly prophesied time in history, for this exact purpose, this is the Logos. I can see him now. I can feel something about him now. The things he says about what it means to genuinely love my neighbor, that's what's missing from Stoicism. Not these nobles who are just doing charitable deeds, kind of to look good, but also just because, I should give things away so I can be humble. It's better for me that way. But not actually doing it out of love. This was the missing piece. This was the missing piece. And so to all those who would reject Christianity because of Jesus's ethnicity, I'm saying that's the whole point. That's the whole point. Tell me where your paganism has specific doctrines, nailed down doctrines about the Jewish people and how what we're supposed to think of them, how we're supposed to feel towards them, why it is that we might be frustrated with things that they do sometimes. It's the whole point of it. And so I suppose that leads on to the universalism then. That's the last point we might have to address. Is Christianity universalistic? Or I suppose we should say uniquely universalistic, because of course there were various universalistic ideas in, I think, all the pagan religions of Europe. I might be mistaken there. But there were certainly tinges, and there were teachings here and there, because Europeans are, as I say in my book, we're a little bit more on the psychopathic side. We're obviously much more individualistic to an insane extent, it seems, than any other group in the world. And so this is why we have this tendency towards universalizing things. We're doing it now. We're doing it now, not just with liberal democracy. We're doing it with everything. We're doing it with everything. So is Christianity uniquely universalistic? I don't see how it is any more than it is egalitarian. In terms of egalitarianism, okay. So there's this sense of equity in law, but I just don't see how Christianity is any different from the Roman project of trying to have us, different tribes, and they're different. They are different, but to be at peace with each other. Christianity just came and said, okay, look, you can be like brothers, okay, and nice to each other, and maybe if there's like an earthquake somewhere, you can go and help some guys out. but that doesn't mean that you have to like give up ethnic ties. Christianity has never said that. That wasn't the Roman project. Okay, Jewish guys, stop being Jewish. You're going to have to. Like,
you're all going to have to be Roman now. Exactly.
You're going to have to start wearing the lace like the Roman guy. No. Nobody said that.
Right.
Right. I mean, by all means, learn some Latin, so we can actually make sense of each other. And that's basically what the Christian project was. If you're going to be an academic, please learn some Latin so universities can talk to each other. Have different tribes. They've got their different kings and everything. But just maybe try and marry your children off instead of, I don't know, killing each other. This was the Christian project. It was just, as you said earlier, John, this is what I believe. It was a perfection of the Roman project. What the Roman project was trying to do, Christianity came and it was just like, okay, now I can do this from the heart. This isn't just an abstract idea that I'm sort of forcing myself to do. I'm actually being emotionally exercised by this. Whereas Stoicism was all about, killing the emotional side of yourself. I'm not sure I need to say much more on that. Am I missing something, John?
No, I think that's very, very clear, Richard, and I think that you're making some excellent points here. It occurs to me as well that I think you pointed to the division between the Americans and the Europeans before in terms of their perception of the church, and I think that that's very legitimate because I can speak from my own personal experience that many Americans do not have the chance to interact with the church in such a way as to actually understand it. And so it's very easy to fall into a kind of automatic reactivity with respect to it, particularly because we get it from every side. The Protestants tell us about all of the ills of the church, and the atheists tell us about all of the ills of the church, and the secularists, and et cetera, the liberals. And so I think that it's important, particularly for people who have not had a living and continual experience of the church in their childhoods and their adolescence, to attempt to gain some right perspective on it. And that means confronting the church's history, the church's writings, its extraordinarily rich intellectual grounding, which in my opinion is quite possibly the greatest and most thorough apologia of any religion in the world. It's just so incredibly comprehensive that you really cannot make an objection to the church that you will not find responded to in one way or another by any number of theologians. So I think it's very important to actually get that perspective. And to your point, Richard, the one that you were just making regarding the question of ethnicity or individual nations, this is easier to perceive, I think, in the case of the Orthodox Church, which of course is different from the Roman Catholic Church in its approach to these things. But one speaks of the Greek Orthodoxy, one speaks of the Russian Orthodoxy. It preserves in a certain way this kind of ethnic individuality. And although the religion is unitary and unified, there are allowances that are given and in fact freely conceded to these individual ethnicities, individual customs, ways, aesthetics. And the Roman Catholic Church does the same thing. It's just not quite as visible in a number of respects, but it has always made allowances for ethnicities on a local level. Its great goal has always been to achieve unity from this kind of diversity without compromising the diversity itself or leveling the diversity itself. Obviously, the church comes first, and that unity of belief comes first, but it's not as if it's going in and just completely eradicating the original differences, and this can be seen in any number of local instances of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church in its particular expressions in the United States is very, very different from what it is in Italy, where I live. It's very, very different from what it is in other European countries, not to speak of other parts of the world. So I think that has to be said. I think that, again, you put it so well, Richard, it's fashionable these days to attack Christianity, and in particular measure to attack the Catholic Church. And we pointed to some of the kinds of antinomies which emerge from this, which these contradictions, these attacking the church from two diametrically opposed angles without perceiving the contradiction inherent in that. And this can be seen in the examples that we propose. There are other examples yet. We've talked about the church being, the supposed birth of communism and socialism. Christianity is also accused of being the father of capitalism through the much famed Puritan work ethic. So I mean, again, this is a way in which it is possible obviously, to make specific critiques of the church, but you cannot do that without understanding it first. And I'm afraid that many people just very hastily attack the church without quite recognizing why they're attacking it. This kind of instinctual reactivity to the church, which I believe has been implanted in us from modernity itself. We wanted to speak, Richard, toward the end of this conversation about why there is not greater interest in the church. And, I'm not even speaking of conversion here, but just interest in the church on the part of the right. Very briefly, I would just like to point out that particularly for those who are very, very willing on the right to critique and to criticize and to censure the church, it's worth recalling that from the beginning of the modern period, the church has been the consistent target of practically the entirety of modern thought, departing from the Enlightenment and continuing up through late-stage liberalism. The church has been loathed by all of these different perspectives. It has been assaulted by all of these different perspectives. They have all of them viewed in the church a bastion of tradition against the coming of progressivism and all of these novelties which we are living with today. And I think that that alone, that single fact, that historical and historically verifiable fact, should point us to the necessity of taking an interest in the church and attempting to understand why it was inimical or at least oppositional with respect to all of these novelties that are at present reaching their very unsatisfactory ends in our present day. So just that is an introductory word to this question. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, Richard. Why you think the church does not elicit greater interest on the right, and why you believe that it's important for that interest to be more common to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. I'd like to thank you for some of the points that you made. As usual, John, I agree with you pretty much 100%. I'm a convert to Catholicism myself. I was actually a Calvinist before.
A Calvinist.
Yeah. People just assume that I was always a Catholic. I suppose when I was younger, I was raised in a sort of very, very liberal Catholic background. In my late teens, I began to become much more interested in religion, and I ended up becoming a Calvinist. And the reason I converted was simply because I read European history. It was actually from an interest in law and my own people in European history. This was when I started to read and I started to ask questions. And I would send professors, people who I thought would disagree with me on certain things, questions so that they could challenge me, that I could actually be challenged. I wouldn't just slip into the mainstream and slither away comfortably. No, I wanted to be challenged because I wanted to arrive at the truth of the matter. I wanted to understand why my civilization was or is where it is now, how it got here. And so I wanted to thank you for saying, read the history. Why is something like this, the doctrine of the Trinity? What's that? It's just so confusing. People are like, what's the point in that? For hundreds of years, it was a really, really big deal. People don't know why, because they don't know Greek philosophy. They don't know all the problems that were coming there. They don't know how something like that came and resolved all kinds of issues and opened new doors. They don't know about any of this. But this mattered a huge amount to our ancestors. These questions and this and questioning and resolving those things, this battling of ideas, this is the heritage of European people. And like I said, the church is just the culmination of this. This is the next stage. It's not just this middle stage, everything's perfect now. No, modernism came, it replaced God with the Leviathan state. Christendom was destroyed, pretty much in the 1500s. But look at the state of things now. People are so spiritually adrift. They're totally spiritually adrift. And of course, that then affects them philosophically. That affects everything. Like I said before, we have to have, and the Romans understood this, a unifying liturgy where we're going to get what is right and what is good. We're going to perceive it. We're going to receive it as well. We should expect to receive something ideal from beyond the material, and we do, and we have. And I'm so saddened by the fact that, you know, people look at the church today and they'll say, oh, look at what's happened to it. Look how liberal this and blah, 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 blah. Well, where are the strong men? Where are you? I mean, I'm not talking to you specifically, John.
No, I understand.
I don't know about it.
I understood the general.
This is what I would say to myself before.
Right.
Where are you? What are you doing? Are you doing anything? You know, I wrote these 2 articles we were talking about earlier. The reason I did that is because I'm trying to contend for my heritage, for my children, you know, for the future of Europe. That's why. And the reason I think there isn't as much interest in the church is because they see this thing which is becoming very liberal. There's some uncertainty as to whether the tradition is going to be maintained. But I maintain that it will, because it has been miraculously maintained for the past 2,000 years against greater odds. And so I think so long as there are good men like us, and good men like I perceive on the alt-right, so long as they go to church, they become involved, and they start fighting for their heritage, that's going to be an intellectual task, but it's also going to involve getting out there and making those intermediary institutions between this horrible big modern state, liberal democratic state, which we all seem to loathe increasingly, apart from the neocons on the right. It's the only way we're going to combat it. If we're going to combat this great big patriarch of an institution, we're going to have to restore the divine, good, ideal patriarch of God, and we're going to have to start mirroring that ourselves in our lives in the institution. So we've got a lot of work to do. And I hope that voices like mine can be the reason that young men aren't put off, and that they start getting involved, reading up about things, getting themselves convinced, getting themselves interested, and saving our civilization.
Excellent, Richard. Excellent. Very, very well put. So unfortunately, to my great sadness, we're going to have to call it quits with this particular conversation at this point. We could easily continue for a great deal longer, even looking with greater depth and clarity at some of the issues that we've already broached. But sadly, we're going to have to leave it there. Richard, it is always...
sorry to interrupt you. If I was a brain in a jar, John, I could probably talk to you for a week.
We'll have to arrange that sometime.
Yeah.
So Richard, as always, it's been a delight. Thank you so much for joining us again. Richard's story to all of our listeners and viewers. Richard's story can be found on the Arktos website. We will also put in the show notes to this particular conversation the links to the 2 articles that we've been discussing, so that our viewers and listeners who are curious can go and read those, and I highly recommend that you do. Please look as well into Richard's book, The Uniqueness of Western Law, A Reactionary Manifesto, which is available from Arktos. And with that, we're going to call it a close to this particular conversation. Some very, very brief news from Arktos. We have a number of titles which have come out since our last interregnum, which certainly bear notice. The first of these, and very, very important book, is the last title by Guillaume Faye, Ethnic Apocalypse, The Coming European Civil War. This is the last book that Guillaume Faye finished writing before his untimely death, and it is a book which takes us into a very, very troubling view of the potential future, which is fast arriving, particularly to Europe, if some change is not made. Perhaps it's too late already, but nonetheless, this is a book which looks at the coming trouble which will inevitably result from the policies that have been in place unhappily here in Europe for too long now. So that is absolutely worth looking into. It is a work which I hope will not prove to be prophetic, but one way or another, it is something that we all of us have to confront, and we have to confront it sincerely and with open eyes, and we have to confront it now. We have also published a number of books, two titles by Alexander Dugin, Political Platonism, and also the first work of his ethnosociology books, which this is actually the first book in the two-part series, but it was published second for reasons of, let's say, internal bureaucracy. And so the consequence is that it's now available, and it is a very, very thorough and very, very fascinating review of the subject of ethnosociology, this attempt to understand the ethnos, which is very relevant as well to what we've been discussing with Richard's story today. Then my own book as well is available now, The New Prometheans, which is an attempt to philosophically ground, it's an attempt to contribute to the philosophical grounding of the new right. So with that, please, to all of our viewers and listeners, follow us on the social media, check into our website for news. Remember to follow Interregnum and to subscribe if you haven't done so already, and to watch our Arktos Journal for many, many different articles which speak to these concerns. I'll mention as well that there was a recent article by Klaus Lyman which talks about economics from the point of view of the right, an excellent three-part article which culminates as well in a discussion of distributism, which obviously has its connections to the Catholic tradition, which we've been discussing here. So thanks again, Richard. Thanks again to our viewers and listeners, and until next time, farewell.